Good evening, history lovers, and welcome to the latest History Ireland Hedge School. And I have to say that, without a shadow of a doubt, this is the most spectacular setting we've ever been in, right up on the walls of Derry here. I'd just like to point out, you know, your complimentary copy of History Ireland magazine there, and if you're overcome with guilt at the generosity, do consider taking out a subscription. While this event has been generously subsidised by the Holywell Trust and the Community Relations Council, the same does not go for the magazine itself, which is subject to no subvention whatsoever except from you, the readers. So I hope you can keep that in mind. Now, the topic here tonight, or this evening, is Protestant Republicans and Catholic Royalists, Legacies of the Glorious Revolution. On the 7th of December 1688, a group of apprentices barred the gates of Derry against the Earl of Antrim's Catholic army, the first major military engagement of the Glorious Revolution. And I want to introduce our speakers here tonight. Immediately beside me here, Sylvia Kleiman of Trinity College, Dublin. At the far end of the table there, Ian McBride, King's College, London. And on my right here, from just across the border, Ardra via Centenary College, New Jersey, Brendan McSwivna. And then History Ireland's online editor, our own John Gibney. And John, I was going to start with you. In interrogating this binary thing we're looking at here, royalism and republicanism, where should we start? Say on the royalist side.
Well, I suppose if you're going to have royalism, the first thing you're going to need is royalty, a monarch or a king, or even a queen. And between 1541 and 1800, Ireland was legally, constitutionally a kingdom. Now, it became this in 1541 by an act of the Irish Parliament, the Act for the Kingly Title, to give it its official term, which defined Ireland, or redefined Ireland's position. Before 1541, Ireland would have been a feudal possession, a lordship of the English, owned by the English monarchy, or possessed by the English monarchy. And after 1541, it acquired a legal status that was, in theory, the equivalent of England or Scotland. Now, in part, this was a reaction to the Reformation, because the original, I suppose, English claim to Ireland in the Middle Ages was legitimated by a papal bull laud obiter. And obviously, you know, the sanction of the Pope was not going to be applicable after the Reformation. So I suppose Ireland was redefined. Now, the thing is that over the course of the 16th century, Gaelic Irish society, which was a profoundly aristocratic society, in Irish tradition, it seems that annalists, poets, Irish magnates increasingly began to articulate or talk about Ireland as a kingdom, as having a crown. Now, this could be a metaphorical device, that there was a crown or throne that was inherently Irish. There were also claims that this might refer to an actual artefact, which had apparently been taken to Rome in the Middle Ages by the son of Brian Boru, who had died in Rome, and obviously then had never brought it back. Sometimes a crown along these lines was depicted. And depictions of this crown, which persist well into the 19th century, depicted quite differently to the British crown. The British crown, or the English crown, I suppose, at that time would have been enclosed, as the British crown still is. The apocryphal Irish crown was opened out. It was splayed, like a kind of, you know, a tiara, perhaps more than a crown. And certainly by the end of the 16th century, figures such as Hugh O'Neill began to talk when they attempted to solicit Spanish assistance for their rebellion at the end of the 16th century. You know, there were suggestions that perhaps the Spanish could be, or a Spanish prince could be given a crown of Ireland. They could become a monarch of Ireland in one way, shape or form. Gaelic poets, in anticipation of the accession of James VI of Scotland as James I, lauded him, you know, articulate the fact that they looked forward to favourable treatment from the incoming monarch. And it seems that certainly a notion of royalism was grafted onto Gaelic Irish culture, you know, sometime in the 16th and early 17th century, and was articulated by a wide variety of writers. Now, we should say, the title of this is Catholic Royalist, and obviously the Irish were not, or the Gaelic Irish were not the only Catholics on the island of Ireland. You would also have had the Old English, the descendants of the early, of the original, I suppose, Norman colonists, who in the 1620s and 1630s would have gone to considerable lengths to reach an accommodation with the crown while retaining their allegiance to the old faith. What were known as the Graces, a list of concessions that were demanded from you know, James I and subsequently Charles I in the 1620s and 1630s, sought to square the circle between, I suppose, Catholic spiritual allegiance to the papacy and temporal allegiance to their monarch. Even in the 1640s, the Confederate Association, their motto was for God, King and Country. And while you may have had various Catholic groups, various individuals, articulating their own discontent at English rule or the increasingly Protestant nature of that rule, at that time they certainly did not do so outside the bounds of thinking in terms of royalism, that there had to be a king, that there had to be a monarch. The monarch might not be immediately congenial, there may be things they want to change, but they weren't taught, they demanded those change within certain limits, and the limits was that they would live in a monarchical society. And in that sense, I suppose, Catholic Ireland would have been largely, almost exclusively perhaps, royalist, at least in the first half of the 17th century, and traces that survived far beyond. After all, we were in a city that was besieged in 1689 besieged by a king, and you would have had a split of allegiances between one king and another king. Nobody would have argued that the king was necessarily a bad thing or the monarchy was a bad thing. And it's worth mentioning, I suppose, it wouldn't have stopped there in the 1640s, because I suppose in 1649 you would have had the rather blunt arrival of Republican beliefs in Ireland in the form of Oliver Cromwell.
John, tell you what, since you brought us up to the 17th century, right, and from way back, I want to bring Brennan in here on the whole question of the if you want to comment on Brennan.
Well, I'm about to display some remarkable pedantry. John talked about a distinction between an enclosed crown and a crown he compared to a tiara. I think the terms are an imperial crown, which is the crown we associate, say, with the Queen of England. And then what John described as the tiara is described as a radial crown. And just as John was talking, the thing that this brought to mind is in 1782 or 1783, just after Ireland had achieved legislative independence in the 1780s, a ship sailed from Derry with an Irish flag, which was the harp beneath the crown. But the Derry merchant that got his flag all with his green background and his harp beneath the crown picked the wrong crown. He put the imperial crown, the British crown, on it rather than the Irish crown. And what Irish patriots were attempting to say in the 1780s is that we can be loyal to the king with this kind of notion that he is the King of Ireland, rather than being loyal to him as the King of England. We don't recognise any right of him as King of England to rule us, but we have this sort of fiction that he's got two crowns and we can be loyal to him as a guy who should be represented by a radial tiara.
Crown, radial crown.
Now, John, I presume you're about to launch into something about Oliver Cromwell. I'm going to bring, am I correct in that? Because I'm going to go on that assumption. Ian, I wanted to bring you in there because I just want to shift to the Republican side of this discussion and look at that great English Republican, Oliver Cromwell, and the fact that many of even the family names that we later associate with the dissenting tradition apparently came over at that time as Cromwellian settlers or soldiers or whatever.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't seem a terribly auspicious beginning from an Irish point of view, this link between Cromwell and republicanism. Just before we get to that, I think I just wanted to reiterate what John was saying about the strength and dominance of monarchical belief, first of all. Monarchy was the totally natural form of government for almost everybody in the 17th century. It was hereditary, and politics was based on land, and land was inherited, and this seemed the most stable way of transmitting political power. Many people also compared monarchs to fathers, and nobody in the 17th century, hardly anybody, questioned the rights of a father to control his wife and his children. And so monarchical theorists would say, there's nothing in the Bible, for example, that says that Adam had to ask Eve or ask his children before he told them what to do. There's no such thing as constitutional government in the Bible. So that's how people thought, Protestants and Catholics. In the 1640s and 1650s, there's an outburst, I suppose, of Republican thinking. And this is a new thing because republics looked as if they were history, I think, in the 17th century. If you looked around in Europe, there was Venice, which many people were interested in, but it's not very important. There was the Netherlands, an interesting case, which was a mixture of hereditary rule and elective rule. And there was Switzerland, but the big powers of the day, France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, were monarchies, and it seemed very much the future belonged with monarchies. In the 1650s, and I suppose slightly before Cromwell, you get the the most important English Republican theorists, and they are John Milton, the poet, of course, but also James Harrington, who produces an important work called Oceana in 1656, which, among other things, argued that Ireland should be replanted by the Jews, should be taken off the Irish and given to the Jews. Again, not a very promising start for the Irish Republican tradition. But those works then get repackaged. And the most important repackager, which might be interesting for this audience, was John Toland, who came from the Inishowen Peninsula and said himself that he spent his first 14 years in this city. And it's Toland who republishes these classic Republican works, Harrington, Milton, and stimulates a lot of interest in these writers around 1700 and passes them on to a new generation. And at that period, he was living in an alcoholic haze in Putney outside London. He was a long time away from Derry. But he was the most important Republican thinker, and very closely related to Viscount Molesworth, another Irish gentleman with an Anglo-Irish career who spent the last days of his life in Dublin in the 1720s. And these two men were the greatest Republicans of the day. But the important thing, I think, to say about them is they didn't think you had to get rid of the monarch to have a republic. And that sounds a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, just develop that, because is this based on the Roman classical idea of republicanism, that public virtue is the main thing?
It's partly that. So the word republic, or res publica in Latin, means common good. And these thinkers argued that in order to have a republic, all you needed to do was have a government that was in the common good. So it didn't act in the interests of the ruler, but it served the people as a whole. And their allegiance, these people like Toland and Molesworth, they said, our allegiance is not to the king, not to the person of the king, but the framework of the laws within which the king operates. And that's being a republican. It doesn't matter whether the government is monarchical in form or not. The key thing is that it's subject to constitutional limits. So it's a rather different idea of republicanism from the one that we have. But in the 18th century, that's the idea that gets taken forward up to the American and French revolutions, when it all changes radically.
Now, Ian, these are theorists. Now, it would be true to say that the actual English flirtation with republicanism wasn't a happy experience. Once Cromwell died, once his son took over, and very quickly the monarchy was restored.
Yes.
With Charles II, which brings us back to monarchy again. If I could go to you, Sylvie. I mean, the biggest monarchy on the block in those days, we're now in the late 17th century, was of course Louis XIV and France. France was the superpower of Europe. Did that have a distorting effect? In other words, when people thought of absolute monarchy, were they thinking of Louis XIV primarily?
Well, I wouldn't tread on the terrain of those who were more specialists in high politics. I think what's very interesting is, and we'll be developing this, I think, over the next while, is this beginning of an entrenchment of the idea that Catholics cannot be amenable to a more democratic communal form of government. And this we will get back to this in a few turns in the 1790s. You have many overlapping legacies, and I think we need to be, since we are in Derry, inching our way towards the 1680s, a very important decade. You have Louis as a model, a self-constructed image of himself as the sole intermediary between the creator and his people. This is very important, this is very developed. But what I think has been underdeveloped is his image, except by French authors who aren't sufficiently translated, and it's very important for the 18th century, even for much later, is the model of Louis, like William, as the providential savior of his people, leading just wars, obviously very debatable, in order to preserve peace for his people. And as a king of war, This is quite important. So you get very important legacies from the Middle Ages. And this being said, the other important, I think probably defining dimension, if we're going to be looking at Anglo-Irish and a little bit of Dutch politics, this triangular relationship and this binding of those nations for geostrategic and emerging mercantile reasons against France, is that Louis will emerge as an absolutist king. He's also a modernizer. You know, the French Revolution modernized France and Napoleon even further. But in terms of what forms of intervention, state intervention, for example, did not exist in Ireland in the 1790s. Louis is a modernizer. But Louis, certainly there's one thing, tragically, by paradox, the year that James accedes to the throne in 1685, Louis begins persecuting the Protestants of France. And he creates a monolithic state. Supposedly he had said one nation, one law, one king, but also that his nation had to be bound to his religion, and you could not have a state within a state. You could not have any other religion. A French king could only be a Catholic.
Now, I want to come into this because this, maybe Ian, you could come back on this. Obviously, that then is a red rag to a bull to the political elite in England.
Yeah.
And to what extent then is James II unfortunate that well, first of all, that he's a papist, and secondly, that he seems to be a shadow of Big Brother Louis across the water? In other words, that people think that he is aspiring to do something similar.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's possible that James II would have screwed everything up anyway.
Okay, yes.
But the context is not a very good one. And as Sylvie said, 1685, Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes, which gave some form of toleration to Huguenots. And he was able to do this, he said, because there were no Protestants left in France. So they didn't exist anymore officially, and therefore there was no need to tolerate them.
Well, his soldiers dragooned as best they could to try forcible conversions, you know, or to... We may get back at some stage to commemoration and history and memory, but the 300 years, the tercentenary in 1985, was a very interesting phenomenon in France in academic circles, but also in terms of how academics reached out to the public. And for the first time, the French really confronted this dreadful episode in their history.
John, I want to bring you back in there because we're up to the reign of James II. There are fears then that he is going to establish, you know, popery. There are fears that there's going to be a Catholic army, etc., etc. I just want to go back to Catholics in Ireland, because this always intrigues me. You know, they had already backed the wrong horse in the 1640s, i.e. the Royalist side, the losing side in the English Civil War, and they were about to back the losing horse a second time. You know, within living memory, you know, within a generation. How can we account for the vitality of that Catholic Royalist tradition at this stage?
Well, I suppose, I mean, one thing about the Stuarts, from the perspective of England, was that the Stuarts, both James II, his brother Charles, and their father Charles I, there was the lingering suspicion held on the part of many English Protestants of a range of denominations, was that the dynasty remained tainted by popery, that they remained sympathetic to Catholicism at a surreptitious level, and if given half the chance, they might reintroduce popery to England. This was a fear that applied to Charles I. It was a fear that applied to both of his sons, you know. And from an English point of view, you might say the reign of James II proved the point. From the point of view of Irish Catholics, though, that made perhaps for a monarch who might be sympathetic to their plight. And in the 1640s, when the Confederate Association had been founded in Kilkenny, and was described by one historian, Pádraig Lenihan, very pithily as basically an organisation that was set up to represent the interests of Irish Catholics to the monarchy, which they attempted to do, and they negotiated with the king through, I suppose, the Viceroy, the Marquess of Ormond, James Butler. But at no time did they ever turn around and say that they wished to repudiate the principle of the monarch himself. They argued that they were loyal subjects of the monarch who had been mistreated by his Protestant servants in Dublin in the outbreak of this in the early 1640s, who had been discriminated against, and they simply wanted redress. Now, this is the whole thing. At no time did they say, well, we don't want, monarchy needs to be dispensed with here. That never entered the picture. After the Restoration in 1660, in the interval, you would have had the vast land confiscation carried out by the Cromwellian regime. There were lingering Catholic hopes that their lands would be restored. And this again was a sentiment put forward by poets, by many of the intelligentsia, especially clerics, writing on the continent. You did have in 1661 an attempt to once again square the circle between Catholic loyalty to the papacy and loyalty to the monarch. And to a certain extent, these were issues that had been relevant earlier on in the 17th century, and they remained relevant into the 1660s and into the 1670s. Now, I suppose at the same time, a monarch such as Charles II was subject to his own particular pressures, was aligned with the French up until the early 1670s, and was perhaps at that time slightly more well disposed towards the demands, or at least some of the demands, of Irish Catholics. I suppose when he got to the reign of his brother, and it was widely suspected since 1673 that the Duke of York had become a Catholic, he stopped attending the ceremonies of the Church of England, and the suspicion was that he had jumped ship. I suppose from the point of view of those Irish Catholics who felt that they had been dispossessed, discriminated against and victimised, that they had been denied restitution after the monarchy had returned in 1660, surely from their point of view, a Catholic monarch was exactly the kind of person who was going to deliver what they wanted, their demands, their restitution as they saw it. I mean, why wouldn't an Irish Catholic be a royalist in the reign of James II? It's exactly, it was all of a sudden here was a Catholic monarch with a Catholic viceroy in Ireland who seemed to be rolling back what had been, I suppose, what many perceived as the Protestant conquest of the 17th century. It made perfect sense from the perspective of Irish Catholics to support that monarch. At no time did they deviate from the principle of monarchy, and that, you could say, remained the case well into the 18th century with lingering Catholic loyalty towards not the king that was on the throne, but the king across the water, the descendants of the Stuarts, the old and young pretenders. Jacobite Ireland was also a Royalist Ireland in waiting, you might say.
Ian, can I just bring you in there? Because in a way, isn't this playing into the hands of, playing into the stereotypical view of absolute monarchy, papist absolute monarchy? One of the things that fueled then the Glorious Revolution. Yeah,
it is. I think, I just wanted to add to that, it's important that every Stuart king married a Catholic. I mean, James I married a convert, Charles I married Henrietta Maria of France, very controversial. Then Charles II and James II are brought up children of a mixed marriage, as you would say, and they marry Catholics, Catherine of Braganza and Mary of Modena. And in each case, they bring, their queen comes to England and brings priests with them. It's very important because you can't practice the Catholic religion in England unless you've got a special dispensation, and of course the queen would. So Catherine of Braganza, for example, has about 20 priests with her, including Irish priests, in Somerset House in a palace in the middle of London. And that's one of the ways that the Irish keep in touch with the continent. So again, there's every incentive for Irish Catholics to stay on board with the Stuart monarchy, because the chances are that they'll get a much better deal from the Stuart kings than from the English Parliament. Now, what was I supposed to be talking about?
I'll tell you what, what I want to get on to is the subject on the table here, which is the Glorious Revolution. Let's ask a dumb question. What is the Glorious Revolution, and what are the principles of the Glorious Revolution? Or is it just a slogan?
It's the transfer of the crown from James II, who was either deposed or abdicated, depending on how you look at it, to William and Mary. And the transfer of the crown is accompanied with a statement of the rights of the English people, the Bill of Rights, which lays down certain rules about the relationship between the monarch and the people, the monarch and Parliament. And what's revolutionary about it, I suppose, is that it didn't just change the king, it changed the nature of kingship. So in the 17th century, if you said to an English person, are you living in an absolute monarchy or not? There was no real way of giving an authoritative answer to that. There were good arguments on both sides. But after 1688, it takes a while to work itself out, so it's not clear-cut. After 1688, there is an answer to that. England is a constitutional monarchy, and by extension, Ireland is subordinate to a constitutional monarchy.
Is that term used, constitutional monarchy, or is that a modern description?
It's the terms are used. Mixed monarchy is used sometimes, limited monarchy is used sometimes, but it's the same sort of idea.
Sylvia, you recommend that?
Is this the landmark moment when the British Crown becomes an exclusively Protestant one?
That's the other very important thing.
It's part of the package is that...
Yes, the only thing they all agree on, the Convention Parliament, which is summoned to sort out the mess once James is gone. The only thing they all agree on is no more Catholic kings.
Why is that central? Because you have the famous slogan on orange banners to this day: civil and religious liberty. And of course, reality is it's the 17th century idea that there can be no liberty where popery flourishes.
Yes.
Why is that? I want to go back to this. You see,
right.
Let's just what is the justification for that? Because of course, in modern terms, it seems a contradiction.
Yeah, there are lots of reasons. England is a Protestant kingdom. It's a Protestant nation. Only 1% of the population was Catholic. In the 17th century, religion was the foundation of all political morality and political organisation. There were lots of people who had different ideas on theology and how the church should be organised and things like that. Almost all of them shared one idea, which was there was one true religion. James is exceptional in this. There's one true religion, and it was the job of the government to enforce it because it was too important to leave to people themselves. If you had a divided population in religious terms, you would have a divided population in political terms too.
But it's about politics, though. Or is it?
Well, it's about international relations partly. It's about, of course, the idea that Catholics owe an allegiance to Rome, which is superior to their civil duty. There are all kinds of factors bound up there.
Rome wouldn't have been, Rome wouldn't have been in very good shape though at this stage, really, as an organisation, either political or religious.
No, but. That's true. It's also true, that Rome couldn't really control most of the Catholic monarchs that did exist. But the idea that allegiance to the Pope somehow overrode your duty to your society or to the government was strong, even in the most liberal thinkers of the day. So John Locke, who writes his letter concerning toleration in 1689, the most famous exponent of religious toleration says you cannot tolerate people who have an external authority outside society that they look to in religious terms, and Rome was an example of that.
Just one point before we move on from the Glorious Revolution itself. How broadly were these principles embraced? I mean, obviously, we're not talking about a democratic society, right? But in a broader group of people, beyond, the political elite, to what extent did this become public property of some sort? In other words, an idea that was out there to be embraced.
I think it's very divisive, and the revolution takes a long time to work itself out. It's followed by the divisions between Whigs and Tories, which cut through society very deeply, and of course it involves ordinary people, including apprentices. When it's the apprentices who bar the gates of Derry, and that means it's the mob, allegedly anyway. It's the ordinary people. So ordinary people are caught up in it, and ordinary people argue about it for decades afterwards.
Brendan, just moving into the 18th century then. I mean, how are these ideas manifested? Because of course they have an effect on the American Revolution then in the 1770s.
We're a long way, I suppose, from 1688, 1690 up to the 1770s. Just to pick up what Ian says, that ordinary people were involved in it, and a lot of what has been spoken of hitherto has been about high politics and high ideas, big ideas. And when one thinks about how ideas change, or how ordinary people deal with ideas, it's important, I think, to bring it all back to a physical place. It's important to bring it back to the lived reality of ordinary people. And if one were to look at the political transformation, say, that occurred in this city in the course of the 18th century, there was contention from relatively early in the 18th century over two interpretations of the Siege of Derry, which Ian did a book on about 15 years ago, when he was younger and blacker hair. But it's there was contention between those who wanted a conservative interpretation of the Siege of Derry and those who wanted a radical interpretation of it. So there was deep contention within the Protestant community about the broader Protestant community of what we make of the siege of Derry. The people who favoured an interpretation in which Mitchelburn was the hero, the people who favoured an interpretation in which Walker was the hero. Within the broader region, within the community, you would find that Presbyterians felt themselves excluded from the polity. If you look at the location of the first Presbyterian church in little towns across North Donegal, they're all located on the edge of town. They're located, if you go up to Lagan and Ashone, it's located down on the shoreline, basically. So Presbyterians felt excluded from society, and they were in many ways excluded. They're certainly excluded from the polity. And within the Presbyterian community here in the Northwest, in the course of the 18th century, you got the bubbling up of Republican sentiment. The little town of St. Johnstone, which is, you could spit to it from here, was the birthplace of Oliver Bond, who was the leader of the United Irishmen in Dublin. Oliver Bond flats are named. Are Oliver Bond flats?
Yes, they are, unfortunately, for Oliver Bond.
But Oliver Bond was the radical St. Johnstone-born merchant, did his apprenticeship in Derry, became the leader of the United Irishmen in Dublin. And Oliver Bond's father, for a period of 50 years or so, was a Presbyterian minister of St. Johnstone. But Oliver Bond's middle name was Cromwell, okay? Which is a good Republican name if you want to be, if you want to be leader of the United Irishmen. Having Cromwell as a middle name wasn't a bad thing. It showed your attitude to kings at the very least. So there were differences within what we've hitherto described as Protestants. So there was a broad range of opinions among Protestants, and within Catholic society, there was a broad range of opinions among Catholics too. So as you were to move forward through the 18th century, you'd want to try and figure out, well, what was changing in a physical place, in a particular region. What was changing that caused people's political opinions, political ideologies to change? What caused their attitude to kings? What caused their attitudes to republics to change? And if you were to look at the Northwest, you'd see a region centred on the port of Derry, which experiences astounding growth in the latter half of the 18th century. Derry's exports of linen yarn crested in the 1770s at around 40,000 carat weight per annum, but its exports of of linen cloth, increased from 40,000 yards in 1771 to 225 yards in 1781 to almost 1 million yards in 1791. So it's an exponential growth based upon the production of linen. So this is becoming a very prosperous place. And within that prosperous society, you see Catholics moving. In the 1750s, Catholics were expelled from the city of Derry. Catholics were told to go beyond the walls of Derry. By the 1770s, 1780s, Catholics are among the quite prominent business people in Derry. You could look at a number of professions in which they excel. They include things like shoemaking, staymaking, which is kind of making women's corsets, hairdressing. What these trades have in common is they tend to require a little bit of meekness, a little bit of modesty. But they're the trades the Catholics start to get their foothold into the city. So the very prominent Catholic United Irishman in this city, Larry McShane, you can trace him from the 1770s through the 1780s up to the 1790s, where he moves up Fawn Street. His shop moves up Fawn Street. He has a little shop at the Butcher's Gate without. His shop then moves up Butcher Street, and he ends up with a shop on the Diamond. So he moves to the physical centre of the city in the 1790s, where a little over a generation earlier, in the 1750s, is a city from which Catholics had been expelled. Some of the best, if you wanted your haircut in Derry in the last quarter of the 18th century, in the 1770s, the best hairdresser in Derry was Patrick Harkin. He had a shop on Ship Quay Street. Neil Carlin on Rosemary Lane, John Kelly and Tom Connor on Ferry Quay Street. These are prosperous people. They're not just a guy with a pair of scissors. They're employing apprentices. They're employing people. And Catholics are becoming part of the public sphere. Like, they can't participate in local government. You know, they have very, very few political rights, but they're becoming part of the public sphere. They're contributing to rewards for pickpockets. You know, pickpockets were as common in Derry in the late 18th century as they probably are today. They were becoming involved in organisations like the Freemasons. You know, so Catholics are gradually moving into city life. And little insults to Catholics, like an advertisement in a newspaper. The Derry newspaper was established in 1772, the Derry Journal. But when it was first established, there would be advertisements saying, looking for an apprentice for whatever profession it was, must be a Protestant. In the 1770s, 1780s, that disappears. By the mid-1780s, you don't see that anymore. You don't see it really by the early 1780s. That disappears. So Catholics are coming in from the shadows. And if you were to look for the institutions that make that possible, one of the kind of guidelines of the public sphere would be the public house, in which Catholics were central. The Catholics owned most of the bars, or ran most of the bars in Derry. And the other would be the public prints. The newspapers have a profound effect on the way people think of their society. But places like public houses, I think, have been underestimated. When we as historians, whatever, tend to talk about bars, we tend to talk about them as a place where people, you know, where sedition is plotted or sedition becomes undone. Yet when one looks at how public houses were run, it's more the sense in which they set the tone of conversation. If you have a public house that's run by a Catholic and you happen to be a Protestant, well, you know, you're going to temper your political opinions in his presence. You're going to temper your language in his presence. So I think we need to learn a lot more about those institutions, both the public prints and public houses, that changed the way people dealt with ideas.
Brendan, you just referred there to the penal laws, right? The exclusion of Catholics. Ian, can I just come back to you on that? Is that a legacy of the Glorious Revolution? Is that part of the package?
Well, the Glorious Revolution accelerates the penalisation of Catholics and it turns it into a parliamentary business. So in the 17th century, a huge amount of land is confiscated from Irish Catholics. Most of it is confiscated before any penal laws come in. The bishops are expelled from Ireland. Catholic bishops are expelled from Ireland. The regular clergy is expelled from Ireland and so on. But when you get a Protestant parliament entrenching itself in the 1690s and onwards, it is able to pass penal laws that deal with the Catholic problem, as it were, in a much more systematic way.
Can I bring John in this, John? Because in a sense, this obviously has an effect then on the Royalist tradition. I mean, in particular, the French Royalist tradition, in that many Catholics, particularly from the Catholic gentry, go into foreign service, and you have the establishment of the Irish Brigade. I mean, how important is that then in keeping alive, an Irish, a Catholic Royalist tradition?
Well, I suppose the Irish military tradition in the 18th century, for the most part, took place outside Ireland, and there were restrictions. I mean, Catholics are barred from the armed forces for much of the 18th century, but as were many Irish Protestants, lest it weaken the Protestant interest in Ireland. But you mentioned that Catholic aristocrats went off to France to fight in the French army, as anyone who's come across Hennessy's cognac will probably testify to. But it wasn't just Catholic. It wasn't just the wealthy strata of Catholic society who went off to become officers. You would have had very, very large numbers of I suppose, the Catholic peasantry, especially from Munster, going to serve as the rank and file in the French army. And there would have been, an Irish military tradition within the French army and a number of other European armies. The Spanish would have had one, but the French tends to be the more famous one, but there was a strong tradition in the Spanish army as well. I mean, it was, I suppose these would have been, and you would have had, you would have had on occasion, you would have had recruiting going on for the French service in Munster, It mightn't be a French officer, but it might be an officer who was Irish and come from a certain locality, had learned his trade, fighting in the French armed forces, and who came back to solicit people from his locality to basically follow him and enter the same service. Now, I suppose that, this would have meant that this would have ensured, I suppose, that service to a foreign monarchy was, I suppose, a fact of life for many Irish Catholics in the south of Ireland, in the very far south of Ireland, in the first half of the 18th century. I mean, the unfortunate reality is that it can be almost impossible to reclaim the experiences of these people, in that, you know, they did not leave testimonies. Unfortunately, a universal problem with history, the further you go back, the testimonies are left with tend to come from the upper echelons of society rather than the lower echelons. But there would have been very, very large numbers of rank and file Irish troops in a number of European armies, most especially the French one. Now, if you were to conjecture on how this would have been, how these people might have felt about it, and I suppose it is the kind of the universal thing about the Irish soldier, like was it a matter of principle or was it a job? I mean, I suppose for some people it would have been earning a living, perhaps some to seek adventure. I suppose if one was of Jacobite sympathies, you might think that, well, surely the French, who were giving sanctuary to a king that you might think was a rightful dynasty of your country, would be a natural army to enlist in. I suppose, I mean, these people they were fighting in the service of a monarchy, and perhaps that service in the French army kept at least some of those kind of royalist or Jacobite sentiments alive, but it's hard to tell, you know.
Now, I just want to change tack here slightly and bring you in, Sylvia, on this, because I just want to go on to the American Revolution, because it's generally accepted that the ideas of the Glorious Revolution were central to it, as I understand it.
Well, I think there are a few interesting things that come out of it. You get these symbols that are very present in history and memory. You get the very important model of a nation born out of war, and people, you know, their rights it's a road to democracy. And so you can see how the Boyne, in a way, is symbolic of that as well. But martial glory is very important in how past events are remembered. You also have the very interesting aspect, if you're still looking at symbols and heroes, of George Washington as the military leader of his people, who then becomes its first president. But I think what we have to retain out of the American Revolution, you have a lot of links, particularly with the north of Ireland, because you've had a lot of Presbyterian emigration. We mustn't forget that the Presbyterians were also victims of the Penal Laws. Some of them leave with some money. They don't arrive destitute in the States. But the new institutions, I presume you don't mean the role of the female patriot, Tommy, that's another hedge school. But you have a cultural revolution in America where people talk politics. And they talk about them in the tavern, as Brendan has said, but females talk about politics. You have different, simpler forms of dress, only wearing American cloth, American fashion, and elite women, give that example. But the most important thing I think we need to take out of that very important phase is the revolution in political institutions, which is going to follow. And you do have an emerging nation where there is freedom of conscience and where Catholics have civic rights. And religious identity is far less important than the communal values of democracy and of hard work. The great paradox is that the late 1770s and early 1780s in Ireland is that the volunteers are formed to defend Ireland against a potential Franco-Spanish invasion, which becomes, part of the European war against the American colonists, and an emerging Hibernicist Irish identity, which is full of paradoxes and is essentially Protestant, but wishes to see itself far more with a local Hibernicist identity, and is beginning to recognise what they refer to as Catholic brethren.
Brennan, you were saying to me that there was an apprentice boys volunteer course set up.
I was, but just to go back to something else, where if you were to think of how this city has changed, something I've become increasingly conscious of. You mentioned, Sylvie, that not everybody who went to America was poor, that some of them were wealthy. Some of the largest merchant houses in Philadelphia in the late 18th century were run by people from the northwest of Ulster. So you'd have Cunningham and Nesbitt was a very large merchant house. There was Blair McClenaghan, he was one of the key people to fit out the revolutionary armies. He was from Convoy. Cunningham and Nesbitt were from Letterkenny and Derry. The Barclays, one of whom became the first American ambassador, or whatever it would have been at the time, to somewhere I've forgotten. It would be Morocco. I forget where it was. But so an awful lot of the very large merchant houses were in Philadelphia. So there's this little connection between this kind of maiden city and the city of brotherly love, and between this broader region and Philadelphia. And it'd be interesting to try and tease that out, like what was distinctive about Philadelphia, this Quaker-dominated city, and how did that feed back into this region? And there does seem to be a little bit of blowback of tolerance. There was a merchant from Strabane who spent his life crisscrossing the Atlantic, called Samuel Carson, who died in the early 1770s. At one stage, this guy would have had investments in something like 20 merchant vessels, and he kept property in Strabane and he had property in Philadelphia, but he died in Philadelphia. And when he died, he said, "I order and desire," he said, "my body to be interred with a small expense and in as private a way as possible. I am not attached," he said, "to any religious society, but wish well to all men, and it is therefore a matter of great indifference in what ground I lie." So Philadelphia, with its kind of, what would the word be? It's sort of mixed religious culture, its kind of tolerance of people, that you wouldn't necessarily have got in Boston or somewhere. But Derry's connection with Philadelphia and the broader region's connection with Philadelphia would, I think, be very important, and it's something that we'd like to know a little bit more about.
I tell you what, I want to get up to the 1790s rapidly, because I'm looking at the time here, right?
So you want to know?
No, I tell you, Sylvia, I want to just bring you in there, because this completely changes the game here. I mean, right, because it seems that's when it's like a flip over almost. So could you just talk to us about that? Why is that significant? Just about the French Revolution, the effect it has on the questions.
I think what Sylvia was kind of hinting at, the American Revolution had a profound effect on Ireland. And if, Ian, you were to think of somebody like Henry Grafton, Henry Grafton, like the towering figure of Irish politics in the 1780s, how should we describe Henry Grafton's politics? Like Henry Grafton wrote in 1780, winter of 1780 to 1781, in a pamphlet, he wrote, reflecting on the free trade crisis, he said, "We've learned a simple and a great truth, that one man is like another and that all men wish to be free." And he was writing about the Catholics. He was saying, like, we can let these people into the polity. Like, is Henry Grafton a Republican?
Ian?
No, I don't think so, no. except in a sort of very vague sense.
Yeah.
But I think America changes everything. So the American colonies, they think their politics is based on the Glorious Revolution, as do the Scots and the English and the Irish, at least the Protestant Irish. And they start the revolution thinking that they're acting out a similar scenario to 1688. And of course it becomes something much more radical, because they draw on the most radical ideas of 1688, including some of the Irish writers like Molyneux and Swift, and in particular the idea that, which both Molyneux and Swift say, which is liberty consists in being bound by laws to which you have consented. And if you're not bound by laws, if you're bound by laws to which you haven't consented, you're a slave. And that feeds through the American Revolution, and it becomes no taxation without representation. But they set up a republic. And so it's partly the drama of it. You can hold a convention and draw up rules of government, which nobody had really thought of before. I mean, you read about this sort of thing in the history books, but here you were actually watching, or at least reading, about people creating their own republic. And it's also very important, especially for Presbyterians, that it's followed by the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. It's a republic without an established church, at least an overall established church. And that also helps to ignite radicalism in the north of Ireland.
Can we move on to the French Revolution now? No, because it does seem central. Sylvie, so because the point is that according to the ideas of the Glorious Revolution, papists are incapable of exercising liberty, yet a Catholic society, France has this revolution. And I know Tone in his writings for one uses this, to say basically that papists elsewhere are ready to embrace liberty, in Ireland in particular.
So we're going to look at the aspects of the French Revolution which are the most important for political ideology, which are the new institutions, which are going to be very much inspired by the Americans, but the French Enlightenment were also very admiring of the British system of the balances and checks between Parliament and monarch. Edmund Burke annoys me because I am half French and a lot of my education was in France. When he refers to the French people demonstrating that they are now ripe for liberty and democracy, and he refers to them as a Catholic nation, nowhere does that appear in Franco-French rhetoric, politics. They don't regard themselves as a Catholic nation anymore. But it's convenient, and I say this to all of you with the greatest of respect, I don't use that, or I counter it when I'm teaching. But I know that many of my colleagues do, because it's a convenient Anglo-Irish solution to an Anglo-Irish problem. But let's get back to this whole question as what is changing. Well, one thing that changed, that was changing much earlier in the 7 Years' War, very important, emerges out of the American Revolution, is the politicization of the ordinary man, sitting around the camp, the soldier around the camp, talking politics, reading pamphlets, reading Tom Paine, popular press, broadsheets. This is very important. And the 1780s in Ireland, 1780s and 1790s, is absolutely no different. So people are generally more politicized. They are talking politics. Females, elite, aristocrats, but upper middle class females are also talking politics. The French Revolution absolutely levels everything. And you have the institution of radical documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which are then going to be translated into laws which are going to enshrine rights. Now, you do have this horrific phase of de-Christianization, 1793, 1794. But the beginning of the French Revolution, in Ireland, Catholics are beginning to gain confidence, reforming Catholics interested in popular politics. The Catholic hierarchy is very nervous. But you have a continuation of the American model of enshrining in law the sovereignty of the people, if they're male, and they pay a certain amount of tax. No, but you have a lot of rights for women, and also freedom of conscience and religious freedom, so long as it is not offensive to other people. So Ireland is in a turmoil because you have a French moment, the early 1790s, when, particularly in the north, you see, and Presbyterians are very vocal about this. A new model, a new world is possible. And in all fairness, it is right that the Irish see this Catholic nation, which is led by a Catholic monarch, asserting their rights, but most importantly, founding new political institutions and a new pact between the governed and those who govern them.
John, can I bring you in there on this? Because it seems to me that the French Revolution completely transforms the rhetoric of popular agitation. So, for example, in the mid-18th century, you have white boyism, which still has a fairly conservative rhetoric, almost a Jacobite rhetoric. Yet by the 1790s, when we get into defenderism, it adopts a Jacobin rhetoric.
Well, I suppose this is one thing that scholars of that period and others, and especially thinking here the late Brendan Abutla, would have put the case forward that in the 1790s there was a blend of these two things. That you did have a blend of the republicanism of the United Irishmen and the lingering Jacobite sentiments of groups such as the Defenders, and that those two came together. I'd kind of move forward a little bit though, because I'm actually going to zip forward into the 19th century, because it's one thing worth bearing in mind how these things can survive, because it's not necessarily the case that you had a kind of the curtain raised were the 1650s with the Cromwellians, and then by the end of the 18th century you had this radical new break and a new ideology. Yes, you did have a new ideology, but other things would have survived. And even if you look at, I mean, Brendan would have mentioned, give a very detailed construction of the physicality of a one-man's career in Derry. But I want to just touch on the physicality of the city centre of Dublin just for a moment. That if you were to stand on College Green and look up at, say, the Bank of Ireland, okay, you will see in the old Parliament House, the current Bank of Ireland, if you're shaking your fist at the Bank of Ireland in anger and disgust, you look up and you will see the crest of the 18th century monarchy that has survived on the building. Now, a lot of royalist symbols and statues of monarchy would have been attacked in the 20s and 30s, and if they weren't attacked or destroyed, the De Valera government started taking them down in the late 1930s, just in case somebody attacked them, you know. But the Bank of Ireland, being a private institution, has kept its. If you look at it, you know, it's kind of hard to get up to and vandalise it. You need a big, long ladder, you know. But you might say it's challenged symbolically with something that's directly across from the top of another building. Because if you look directly across College Green, there's another statue freestanding on top of the old National Bank. And the statue was put there in the 1890s. Now, the statue is Hibernia, okay? Given that she's on top of a bank, she's surrounded by the accoutrements of commerce, and there's a harp. And on top of the harp is Brendan's friend, the radio crown. Now, that statue was put there in 1896, okay? At a time when you could say that republicanism was a very weakened force in Irish life. That a rather different strain of Irish nationalism had become dominant at that time. I mean, a couple of years earlier, you would have had the death of Charles Stewart Parnell. What's the great phrase that Parnell was described as? The uncrowned King of Ireland. Now, that statue that was erected a couple of years after Parnell's death was erected by the firm of Pearce and Sharp. The Pearce in question was the London stonemason James Pearce, whose two sons, Patrick Pearce and Willie Pearce, were executed for their involvement in the Easter Rising of 1916. Now, within a couple of years of the erection of that statue, you would have had the centenary of the 1798 rebellion and, following on from that, the Boer War. Two events that would have really kind of rejuvenated radical nationalism and especially republicanism, though at a surreptitious level. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was revived around the time of the 20th century, very much around those two events, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood was the organisation that would have carried out the rebellion for which the two Pearce brothers were executed. Now, one anecdote that is often instanced in relation to the Easter Rising is a conversation that apparently took place between Patrick Pearce and Joseph Mary Plunkett within O'Connell's, the GPO on O'Connell Street, where they apparently seriously discussed the prospect. Bear in mind, the Rising was taking place in the middle of the First World War, and there have been active attempts to solicit German assistance for the rebellion, just as United Irishmen had solicited French assistance for their rebellion. But Pearce and Plunkett apparently were having a conversation that was overheard, and it was a conversation with the possibility of getting some kind of German prince, some nephew of the Kaiser, to basically become a king of Ireland. Now, that's not a very Republican sentiment. Now, I'm not saying Patrick Pearce was a closet monarchist, but to even think along those lines indicates that the principle of monarchy wasn't something that was necessarily repugnant to him. Now, that may just have been Pearce and Plunkett arguing the toss, and, you know, in time of war, if we're linking up with the Germans, what's a practical means of getting independence, you know? But even Thomas J. Clarke was asked by someone else, well, why a republic? Why did you go for a republic in your proclamation? And his answer was, well, you have to have something to capture people's imaginations, okay? Now, the point I'm making is that I'm not saying royalism survived, but a certain sense that the principle of monarchy wasn't repellent survived in the Irish nationalist tradition, and I suppose even in elements of the Republican tradition into the 20th century. You know, that regardless of what happened in the 18th century, this older set of beliefs seemed to have survived and survived and survived at some level, and popped up in a very unlikely place in 1916.
It's going to pop up again in 2016, apparently.
Very good.
Ian, I tell you, we can't have a discussion with republicanism in it without talking about Theobald Wolfe Tone. But I just want to, is the radio mic in the room? Because I want to go to the audience shortly. Mark, is the radio mic here? Yeah, we have it here. That's okay, right? Sorry, I should have warned you earlier on, by the way. When you come to a hedge school, you don't just sit back and relax and enjoy yourself. You have to consider participation as well. So while you're gathering your thoughts for a few questions for our panel, I want to go to Ian here because does Tone then transform the meaning of? I mean, I don't just mean Tone himself, because I'm talking about the United Irish Project. You know, not just now focused narrowly on one person. But does that change the game completely? Does it completely, reinterpret the whole meaning of it?
Yes, that's important because I think, I said earlier on in the early 18th century, you could say you were a republican, meaning you were essentially a constitutional monarchist. You know, you believe in constitutional monarchy. And I think that changes in the 1790s. Everybody in Ireland is spellbound by the French Revolution. It's hard to exaggerate the excitement that it produced. And now, of course, you think, you know, there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube, and people just read about it in the newspapers. But all people at the time said this had an electric effect on the Irish people. And it really changes the meaning of republicanism, because to be a republican in the 1790s comes to mean being on the side of the people against the enemies of the people. And the enemies of the people are, to begin with, aristocracy, and then monarchy, and also clerical establishments. I mean, the clergy, insofar as they are a separate order of people. And so it's a rejection of social hierarchy.
But just to come in there, not against aristocrats, all of them. And if the aristocrats took their stand on the side of the people, that was acceptable, was it not?
So if you were an aristocrat,
Lord Edward with a short haircut.
Yes,
you know.
okay. There's Edward Fitzgerald. If you reject hereditary privilege, then you're okay.
Right. Okay.
That's definitely true. So it's a rejection of hierarchy. It's a rejection of church establishments. It's a much more radical, subversive ideology. And of course, in Ireland, it's also bound up with breaking the link with England, which previous republicans had not thought necessary. You could renegotiate the Anglo-Irish relationship to give the Irish a better deal. But this meant, as Toland put it, breaking the connection.
But then
Can I just say one thing extremely briefly, is that obviously Toland's writings were published posthumously, so a lot of what we have read, people were not reading at the time. But through the United Irish Project, and particularly when he asks the French, he's the main diplomat for intervention, for military intervention, you do have a goal, which is a separate Irish nation. You have the French recognising the Irish right to sovereignty. And you do have the idea that when Irish does break the link with Britain, that the only political institutional model possible is a republic.
Now, Ian, I just want to come back to you on the ideas of the United Irishmen, because they're obviously influenced by the American and French revolutions. But I know in amongst historians there's a view, you know, that really this is just kind of a new style of, or a more radical type of Whiggism, you know. In other words, it's the Glorious Revolution for a new age. Or is there a contradiction there? I mean, is that a false contradiction? I mean, is it all of a piece?
Well, Samuel Neilson, who runs the Northern Star in Belfast, and you know, as much as anybody else, is the man at the centre of the whole United Irish network, says after the French Revolution, 1688 is merely local, you know, whereas the French Revolution is global, and that's one of the other things. Of course, it's supremely arrogant. You know, it turns the clock back, turns the calendar back to zero, and says this is the first year of liberty, and it's designed for export. And the English Revolution, 1688, wasn't. But the French see themselves as declaring the rights of man to humankind, so it has much more internationalising impact.
But can the ideology of the United Irish be seen as a legacy of the Glorious Revolution? That's what I'm getting at.
Well,
or is that too tenuous?
Yeah, it can, because, I mean, for example, they appeal to the ideas of John Locke, who is, you know, on the radical edge of the Glorious Revolution. So they're picking up elements of that and then reworking them against the background of France. And one of the ironies is that the opposite is happening with Edmund Burke, who, of course, is remembered as the father of English conservatism, and according to Michael Gove, the greatest Tory ever, but was an Irishman. And Burke's doing the opposite. He's taking the conservative aspects of 1688 and distancing them from what happens in France and creating a new kind of tradition where, you know, the French are the sort of intellectual, abstract, you know, polo neck wearing crowd, whereas the English are pragmatic and traditional and stolid and so on.
Now, there were other people, of course, who made a more explicit connection back to the Glorious Revolution in the 1790s. That was the Orange Order, founded in 1795. is there, I mean, the point is there's a gap of a century there between the founding of the Orange Order and the actual events that it commemorated, or is there? I mean, is there a continuation there, or can I, a la Edmund Burke, say it's the Orange Order was the innovation, it's the United Irishmen who actually carried on the true tradition of the Glorious Revolution?
Well,
said he provocatively.
But the Glorious Revolution is commemorated throughout the 18th century on the 4th of November in Ireland and elsewhere, and that was the birthday of William of Orange. So in the 18th century, all the anniversaries, in fact, were in October, November. There was no marching season. There was a sort of autumn season of listening to sermons on 17th century events. And there was then there are references in newspapers to the commemoration of the Boyne as a victory over the Irish. So that does happen, but it is completely subordinate to the idea of the Glorious Revolution as a bigger constitutional and religious event. And then what happens in the 1790s? Do you want to go on to that?
Oh, go on, yeah.
In many ways, it draws out one aspect of the revolution, which is its Protestant character, the Protestant succession, and it's a response, the emergence of the Orange Order, in lots of ways, to the end of the Penal Laws. The Penal Laws kept public life in Ireland Protestant, and they excluded Catholics from public life. And in 1778 and 1780s, the Penal Laws begin to be repealed. In 1793, Catholics get the vote under certain circumstances and the right to bear arms. And the Orange Order takes off in 1795, but particularly against the background of this concern with arms bearing. Catholics can do lots of things they couldn't do before. They get longer leases, they're treated better, and they can have weapons. And in a sense, I think the background to the Orange Order is a reaction to the reform of the Penal Laws.
Now, I'm going to go to the audience at this point because I can see the clock is ticking on here. Anybody in the audience like to make a contribution or ask a question, just put your hand up and use just the back here, and we can use the radio mic. This is all being recorded here, by the way, so keep it clean.
William Campbell, I'm a local. And in regards to Irish Protestant republicanism in the city, I know the night's lecture was broad-based, but I thought there would be more emphasis on that. The Protestant Republicans played a very important part here, especially during the 1649 siege, when the city was held for Republicans. And they also played an important part along with Presbyterians and the Episcopalians in the siege. But unfortunately, the Penal Laws against non-conformists made them go to America. And even in America, the Puritans and the Presbyterians couldn't agree. In New York, the Presbyterians weren't allowed to settle there. They were allowed to settle in Pennsylvania or go west. So the Protestant republicanism aspect in regards to the city has been ignored. There's a Republican canon not far from here on the city wall. So I was hoping that there would be more about the Protestant republicanism. Also, how it has come down. There are many unionists at the moment who would be Republican in aspiration.
Anyone in the panel want to come back on that?
In an oblique sort of way, one of the interesting little snippets of Derry history is that on the centenary of the siege in 1788, 1789, the radicals within the city of Derry proposed to erect a monument to the apprentice boys. And they were pushing this on the corporation, and the corporation says, a monument to the apprentice boys, you know, this is ordinary people's agency. That isn't necessarily a good idea. So they counter-proposed, let's have a statue put up to King William, our deliverer. And it being Derry, neither statue ever went up on top of Bishopsgate.
I just want to make a very brief point for this gentleman. One of the big problems is that we're essentially 17th and 18th century historians. But the second half of the 19th century in most Western countries is a very important point for history writing, but also for public memory. And you have the famine is seen also in Irish history as a dividing line. And from that point onwards, Irish America, up until very recently, is associated with Irish Catholic America. And Irish Americans of other roots and other traditions know their roots and their traditions, but there's an overwhelming, ever so slightly crowding everyone else out of the story. And I think that that is a point that needs to be reinforced, is that there are multiple origins in Irish America.
Yeah, and just to speak to the point of Protestant Republicans, like if in the late 18th century in the city of Derry that the United Irishmen were heavily Presbyterian, well, what happened to the republicanism of those Presbyterians in the early 19th century? It's a subject of, you know, immense interest. And we can look at changes in geopolitics, we can look at the rise of Napoleon, we can look at economic factors that impacted upon it, we can look at how the public press, you know, which had been a kind of greenhouse for political ideas, was changed, and the state corroded the public sphere and degraded the public sphere. And we can construct explanations of Presbyterians' retreat from republicanism. And yet, without drifting into romanticism, I think it's important to say about this region that this region isn't, you know, Derry was never ported down. You know, there wasn't the belligerent Orangism in the northwest of Ulster that there was, say, in mid-Ulster. It's a very different political culture in northwest Ulster, that the political culture of northwest Ulster historically was liberal and remained liberal through the 19th century. So without romanticising these people, one thinks of, though he himself was a Catholic, one thinks of, say, George Segerson, you know, his family were Presbyterians, he was related to the Nielsens. One thinks of Thomas Nielsen Underwood of Strabane, who was a prominent Fenian. You can think of James McKnight, who was the editor of the Derry Standard in the 1850s. James McKnight said that the two worst things in Ireland, he said, are Church of Ireland landlords and Catholic priests. You know, you can do business with a guy like that. You know, you can work with a fellow like that. So that liberal Republican, call what we will, element in Presbyterian culture, in Northwest Ulster culture, is something that's worth keeping sight of.
Yeah. Hold on, just to use the radio mic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add a comment about Irish American. I've just come back after 25 years there. Don't get confused about Irish American. There's the northeast and the far west. The northeast, heavily populated by the Irish Catholic tradition. I spent the last 20 years in the Deep South. The Deep South has tremendous connections with Ulster, with non-conformists, and they've also been very active in things Irish. But it hasn't all been of the Catholic and nationalist tradition that Irish Americans turn to. When you look at America, remember it's a subcontinent. And you look at the 50 states, you look at the southern states, and it's quite a different composition. It's much, much older immigration. If you look at what comes down from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, totally different traditions, and a long tradition also with Scotland. So don't get misled by everything that you see in the media about Irish American.
Anybody else in the audience? Yeah, Dara, yeah.
Well, I suppose I could add something to each of your contributions. John mentioned the republicanism in Sinn Féin. I suppose Arthur Griffith, who was the founder of Sinn Féin, was, and the first president of the Free State, remained a monarchist right through pretty very long. But Brendan talks about I think, you know, kind of what happened afterwards. I think that you, editing John Campbell's travelogue or whatever, that actually gives a window on that whole transformation that happened. On issues of the Glorious Revolution and all the rest. It was preceded, of course, by the Scottish Covenant, which was a covenantal relationship with monarchy. And that ran very much through the 18th century, and we can't forget that the aim of the United Irish Society was not just to unite Catholics and Protestants, but Catholic Protestants and dissenters, and that dissenter tradition, survived right through, like John Mitchell and other Derry Presbyterian would have been possibly the last of the great 18th century radical Protestants. I think so that struck me that really not enough attention was possibly focused on that dissenter tradition and where that emanated from. But I think the other thing mentioned in America is that the American Revolution was very much a product of Masonry, the Masonic influence in the founding fathers of the United States. Whereas the French Revolution was a product of the Enlightenment, and not just the French Enlightenment, but also the Scottish Enlightenment, and that the ideas that would have emanated from Scotland would have had a huge influence. Here, obviously, with the Northern Star, which you mentioned as well, Ian, and the fact that Ulster had that literate society was hugely important, because there was that dissemination of ideas outside of the control of the authorities. So.
Yeah, don't know the memory. I'll wrap up on that. Yeah. Just gentleman over here. Yeah.
I was trying to do a bit of research lately on the dairies and London dairies in North America, particularly in New Hampshire, and I was thinking of MacGregor in 1718. But as far as I could see, most of the particularly the groups of people led by ministers, particularly MacGregor in 1718, all of their discussions seem to be about theology and economics. I wonder how much, and there is this thing that the Ulster, they bring the Declaration of Independence and done that, but all of that. How much do you think did they bring politics with them, or is it, from what little I've read, seems to be largely to do with theology and with economics because of the taxes? So I wonder, sometimes we say that, did they bring republicanism there? Where do they sit with that?
Yeah, I think very quickly. I mean, MacGregor said, we're going to escape oppression and bondage. So they brought with them a sort of myth, and I don't mean, it wasn't true. I mean, it was important to them. They thought they were going to a land of liberty, and that implied that, a system of political persecution at home. The other thing they brought with them, I think, in the 18th century was the memory of Derry and Enniskillen. And whenever the Congress wants to mobilise Presbyterians in the back country, it sends out people to say, we are continuing the battle that your forefathers fought at Derry and Enniskillen, and that's the thing that gives them their identity more than anything else, I think, that sense of history.
Yeah, but by the same token, I think it's important when we think of Presbyterians in America, we don't think of them as cut off from Ireland. That particularly in the latter half of the 18th century, there were intimate connections between this city and, let us say, Philadelphia, between this city and, in the early 19th century, Baltimore. That people knew what was going on in America. George Washington's favourite general was Walter Stewart. When the war was over, Walter Stewart, who'd been born in Derry, came home to Derry and lived in Derry for a number of years. Washington was godfather of his children. Out in Limavady, they composed a poem to welcome him home. And it was, it described the war as when murdering Britain, the sword drew against her faultless sons and bid adieu to justice, mercy, honour and the laws. But there was a close connection. When you look at little things during the American War, when there'd be a declaration that the King says we must all have a day of fast for the success of British arms in America, so all taverns would have to close. Well, Campbell's at the bottom of Bishop Street, or whatever street it was on, the Mitre on Bishop Street, he had a son fighting the British, essentially, in America, fighting the King's Army in America. And these are things that people were aware of. So yes, they're in America, but it's not necessarily what they had brought from Ireland should be our only concern. It's what was the blowback from America. Like, people crisscross the Atlantic much more than we give them credit.
And yeah, John at the front. Okay.
First of all, comment and then a question. Comment, my understanding is, given the number of Ulster prods who were parties to the Declaration of Independence, and the fact that I'm told statistically almost a third of the American soldiers in the War of Independence were Ulster prod tradition, that certainly suggests that there's a very strong, once you get away from these shores, non-royalist tradition amongst the Protestantism. But secondly, a question to come a little bit more up to date. You may rule me ultra various here for raising this, because we've been talking about quite ancient history. I'd like to ask for views on things that are 20th and even 21st century, given that the antennae that you historians have. I discern in recent opinion polls the suggestion that statistics of the people of the nationalist, presumed nationalist population are very happy indeed. Thank you for the short and medium term with the status quo in terms of constitutional arrangements. On the other hand, amongst the unionist tradition, with the implosion that could be happening in the United Kingdom, the Scottish devolution, with the rise of UKIP and little English nationalism, I'm just wondering if you can discern any emerging different self-awareness amongst the Ulster Protestant population. In other words, on the one hand, there's a view that the nationalists are centrist, pro-UK. On the other, the possibility of unionism being a little bit more ambivalent about it in the strange things that are taking place around us at this time.
Thanks, John. I tell you, I'll just hold that thought for a second, right? Because you did anticipate it to some extent, not fully, because I was going to go on to you, Ian, to finish up, right? I'll come back to that in a second, John, not leaving it hang. Is the question of memory, because we have been talking about issues here which, by the way, we've only got through about half the stuff that I'd intended to discuss. This happens at hedge schools all the time. It suggests other ones, even in Portadown, possibly. Right? We're working on that, right? No, but it's a question of memory. In other words, that no matter what we might talk about here, but the actual complexity of how allegiance that have switched and, you know, are ambiguous, whatever, that people later will just construct it any old way at all, and it's a completely different view then that prevails.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mean, what's the impact of academic history?
Is there any point in us being here at all?
Well, it has some impact.
I know, but I know you've done some work on this.
I'd say on the Glorious Revolution itself in England, if you look at the centenary, tercentenary commemorations in 1989, 1988, I was looking at my audience. Some of you were obviously around then. There was a big programme to highlight the importance of the revolution as a sort of, landmark in the path towards democracy. And in fact, the next year, Margaret Thatcher went to France for the pyrotechnics there and said, "You didn't invent democracy, we invented it 100 years before you." And it was a damn squib, and part of that was because of the history that had sort of seeped through into the chattering classes, at least. Because unsurprisingly, perhaps the opposition was led by Tony Benn, but there were lots of people. There was a protest in the Cambridge Union. There were other sorts of protests, and said this did nothing for Ireland. It did nothing for Scotland. It did nothing for Catholics. It did nothing for the ordinary people. And we shouldn't be celebrating it. And I think that owes something to revisionist historians in England and how they had changed popular opinions on it.
Yeah, but you might respond to that though. Even if it's an incorrect view, isn't there something positive that if people think the Glorious Revolution is about democracy?
Well, I'm not. I mean, Margaret Thatcher thought that. I'm not sure how many other people actually did.
Sylvie, if you want to come in on that.
Think there was a point the gentleman made who lived in the south of the United States that made me realise is that Republican cultures in the Atlantic world, including the Franco-American models, whatever, we have this other problem towards the end of the 19th century. John made the point about lingering feelings about royalism. You have the Americans wishing to distance themselves from red republicanism because in the countries that had an industrial revolution, you have a spread of trade unionism, of that form of political organisation, of communism. France has socialist undertones. And so American republicanism represents different values. I would like to say to John, since he did ask us our opinion, and I will say it very briefly so that my hedgemaster doesn't rap on my fingers, I would say leave history out of contemporary politics. It's been abused and misappropriated a little bit too much. Or get back to the archives and dig up even more facts.
I'll come back to that at the end, John, but a question from the floor here, and we're going to be wrapping up fairly shortly.
I'd like to ask the panel, why was the west bank of the Foyle not extended in 1925 when the Boundary Commission came on to bring in the large population of Presbyterians and Protestants who lived on the east and the Gaul border?
The big problem of all those Catholics up in Inishowen.
That's a different discussion. We may have a hedge school on that. You never know. You know, we've had many up to this. Now, I just want to conclude, and I want to just address some of the remarks here, or the question that John posed, right? And I say I don't live here, right? But it seems to me that one of the problems is that, and I think maybe it's a flaw in the peace process as well, that people are defined, the two traditions, parity of esteem, which as working models, have their place in dealing with the immediate divisions. But the problem then is if you take that and you project it back into history and you come up with some sort of an essentialist, that in other words that people are hardwired either to be one thing or the other, rather than seeing, say, either nationalism, stroke republicanism or unionism as rational choices. In other words, can one become a unionist or can one become a republican? I think that's what you're hinting at there in terms of opinion polls. Now, people, of course, are reluctant to actually say, change their label, if you like, but they might say, well, we're happy enough for the moment. And I think maybe that might be a more fruitful direction for people to start thinking. But then I think it also behoves maybe the loyal orders to interrogate what civil and religious liberty means today, what it means in relation to ethnic minorities, for example, which is an issue, So I think that will be a positive way of interrogating history rather than just raking up history as ammunition to throw at the other side. But that may be just a pious aspiration on my part, But listen, it falls on me to wrap up. I'd just like to thank all our speakers, Brendan McSwidna, John Gibney, Sylvie Kleiman and Ian McBride, and especially yourself, the audience, and in particular those who have made a contribution. The next History Ireland Hedge School will be at the Electric Picnic. So if you're put your wellies on, if you're going, would be my advice. And I think well, we've two, but the first one will be on the First World War, a great war or a good war. That'll be an interesting one. So maybe we might see you there, or we'll certainly be back in this part of the country, I'm sure, within the year. So thank you very much.